I'm going through Genesis chapter 2 today. I read that this morning. I always try to read it afresh right before I share to see what God will lift for me. And that's what I encourage you to do. As you're reading the Bible, you're not on any time schedule, quite honestly. There's no pressure of how long it takes you to read through the Bible. Just read it prayerfully and let God open your eyes. Every time I read the Bible, even something that I've read over and over again, if I will prayerfully approach it, asking God to open my eyes of understanding for something helpful, something useful, I see something different. And as I've read chapter 2 of Genesis again, in my effort to understand what can we learn from God's process of creation, it jumped out to me, a pattern jumped out to me today that had not previously came to me in that same simple way. And what I noticed is that it's like God created it all at once and then began to unpack it. So in chapter 2, it says that God completed his work on the seventh day. And on that day, God rested. Now, for the first time, not for the first time this time, I have recently begun to recognize that that's not necessarily communicating that God did all the work in 6 days, not right here. Right here, the way it reads in a couple of different versions that I've read is that God worked up, and it was on the seventh day that the work was completed, and then God rested. So it seems here anyway that, God did work on the seventh day, and what was sanctified and celebrated by God, and we were told to always sanctify that seventh day, is because it was the day of completion. It was the day that God reached the goal, the day that God got it all done. And so the notion of doing nothing on the seventh day blessed me to understand, because I've struggled sometimes. It's like to have a whole day, the seventh day to set aside. Religions have been built around, the seventh day and so forth. But our understanding of what that means, I think it's important, so that we don't get I was overly stressing myself about doing any kind of work on the seventh day. And so it said, God stopped working and celebrated and blessed and sanctified that day. Then for the first time this morning, it jumped out to me. I dug into what it meant in the King James and the Revised King James, when it said that this is the generations of creation. So what's happening here in chapter 2, it seems to me, is that the word is now going back and unpacking all that happened in those 7 days of creation, bringing about detail of what God did during those 7 days. Basically, the generation, the word interpreted generations in the old Hebrew meant it was the history, the chronology, the process, the record of how God did the creation over time. And it began, the first thing that was noted was that there were no plants and vegetation at that time, because God hadn't caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man. So that said to me that growth for plants and vegetation required rain, and it required mankind. And I began to think as I'm reading, because it's there saying that the reason that these herbs and plants weren't there was because there was no water, there was no mankind. And then it goes from there to immediately address the water situation, to say that then a mist came up from out of the earth. I think of rain, we think of rain as coming down from the heavens. And I begin to ponder that. And as I read and go through further chapters of the Bible, I'm going to see if it bears out. It's because the only time we heard about rain was when Noah and the flood, water's coming from the heaven. But prior to that, this talked about rains coming up, or water coming up from the earth, meaning the water was already in the earth. What was needed for the growth and expansion of plants was already inside. Had already been created. And so God brought it up, and it established a river that branched off and then created other rivers, and they watered the earth and the garden. And then it turns, the scripture turns to, then God created mankind. Okay. And it said that man was created, the vegetation, and it turned back to the water. Vegetation was watered through the river. The river then, as I said, branched out. Okay. And then man was provided to work. So in order for something to grow, something has to be actively happening. There has to be the addition of water. There has to be the addition of some kind of labor, some in those things that we could see in terms of plants and vegetation. Most of the time, those that we want to intentionally grow require our labor. I've got to plant the seed. I've got to fertilize. I've got to, cut off the dead leaves and all of those kinds of things. But even when there's not man taking care of and tilling the soil and so forth and so on, there are workers who are moving around in the earth. They're the earthworms and the bugs underneath that are just moving around and eating and wasting and what have you, and churning and creating healthy soil underneath for plants and vegetations and their roots to grow. And so it's already in there. And in God's creation. And so I'm struck as I read through and as I go through, and you see that in the title, that what I come away from with respect to chapter 2 is the fact that when God created it, all that's needed for growth and expansion is already on the inside. And we see that again when God declares it's not good for man to be alone. He needs some help. When I broke down and research those words, help meet. It is not, we will create a help meet for mankind. Those words, I was amazed to find that it meant man needed someone to surround, to protect, to support in times of trouble, to support him, to protect him. Okay, to be an assistant, to be there with them, to aid them in their time of need. And so God said it is not good for man to be alone. He needed a help meet for him, someone qualified and ultimately became another human being to assist, to support, to boost, to strengthen, to encourage. And the only folks who can really give, the only beings that can really give that kind of comfort and help is a living being that understands the life and the needs of the human being. And so as God had man to sit there and go through all the creation, every cattle, meaning every, horse-like or cow-like, being, every living creature brought before man to examine and to give a name for. But among them, none was found to be the right match to meet the need of the human being. And so what did God do? God went inside of the man and took a rib and created what was called the woman. It was already inside of the creation of mankind, what was needed for mankind. And Adam, we later call, but the man called the new creation woman, not female, woman, that which is out of me, out of mankind, which is like me, which is a part of my body, a part of my being, an extension of me. And then the chapter ends with, and for that reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Now, wife, I researched that word, only meant woman. And as I analyze and think about all of that, interesting enough that it shows up right here in this place in the creation history and the creation story. But what it says is that a man, we leave our parents, our sources of original life, our initial creation places to cleave to. A man cleaves to, pursues after, joins with, holds fast to that which is a help meet for them. That person, that woman who is helpful, supportive, aiding, encouraging, empowering, strengthening, protecting. And that's the one that you cleave to. That's the one who is a part of your life that you are joined with in life to begin another family, another life cycle creation, as it were. And so I was thinking about that in the context of, of what it means to be in that kind of male-female relationship, husband and wife. And it's not just the human notion that you grab somebody of the opposite sex or opposite gender, or same gender for that matter, and ran down to the justice of the peace. No, that's a unique situation. You cleave to that which is the help meet for you as a man. And you are a help meet for a particular man. If you are not help meet, that's not an ordained relationship that God would have us to have. I know there was a lot of haves in there. But as I'm thinking about, as I said, I'm reading through this Bible prayerfully, thinking about what can I learn here. That's why it's so important for us to lean to God, lean into God and listen to God in our choice of relationships and spouses, because there is that one who is for you and others are not. And too many times we make the mistake of marrying and making covenants with those who are not the help meet for us. So anyway, overall, I come away from chapter 2 recognizing that when God creates, when we create, what we're looking for, what we need for the next step is generally going to already be provided. It's already inside. The water was, when we created, it's in the earth. Okay. The woman was in the man already. The rivers that flew out and eventually became oceans started with one river that came out of the earth. And so when we're looking for things, look first inside. Look first for what is already there, already provided. Most of the time, what we're looking for is right in front of our eyes and we can't see it. It's simplistic, but it was helpful, is helpful to me as I try to journey on in this life, which is not as simple oftentimes as it may seem, in understanding God's will for us and how God is moving. And so I hope that you have gotten something out of it. And I hope, whether it's what I saw or you got something different, love to hear what you've gotten out of reading Genesis chapter 2.